Hi, everyone, and welcome to what I hope to be a riveting conversation with a group of exceptional panelists that we have here today. And we're going to be talking about what's really shifting from the streets to the boardroom, right? And that businesses are playing a much more active role in providing solutions to some of our more hairy problems as a society. So we're going to talk about the points of intersection, right? The fight for racial justice is not siloed. It's not siloed away from what's going on in the inequities in healthcare, in energy, in policy, in things that really impact people's lives. We're going to talk about what leadership looks like, as a brand, as an organization, internally and externally. How do you make sure that as you are advocating that you are living those values yourself to have credibility as a company, as a brand? And last but not least, we're going to address what does it mean to be a brand ally, right? What does that mean for the causes that are there for our society? And so we're going to get right into it, and we're going to start, Ben, with you, if I don't mind, if you don't mind. Um, Oftentimes, racial justice and the climate crisis are seen as maybe being disparate things, but we know that they're all points of intersection. Would just love to hear from you your perspective on um, what is the talk to us about that interconnection and why it's important.
Yeah, thanks, Conroy. Conroy, great to be with you. Great to be with you as well, Chris and Orson, and good to join you all here today. So Fresh Energy is an independent energy policy nonprofit, and so we do a lot of our work at the state capitol. Really working to advance clean energy laws, and working directly with utilities and other stakeholders. We decided a few years ago that we have to work more explicitly on equity in the laws and policies that we're shaping. So who's actually benefiting, who's being impacted, who's at the table in really, developing these policies. And I have to admit, while I'm proud of our leadership in really helping to drive that conversation, I think this year was a moment of reckoning for us. We realized we really needed to address the topic of race and systemic racism head on. And to be quite honest, we weren't doing anyone any favors by being timid on those topics. And I think that's what a lot of folks and different organizations and companies are wrestling with right now. Um, for us, we have to recognize that we have immense power and privilege in being able to work in the spaces that we do, because they matter. Just to give an example from here in Minnesota, there was back in the 1950s a thriving Black neighborhood known as Rondo. And up until that point, it was, as I mentioned, thriving, economically rich. And around that time, state and city decision makers decided that was going to be where they were going to route one of the new major highways that was being built at that time. So in the 6 or 7 decades since, it's really been one of the main corridors connecting Minneapolis and St. Paul here in Minnesota, resulting in tons of pollution from fossil fuel powered vehicles, the urban heat island effect from all of the concrete and the loss of trees. And so, these are just some of the factors contributing to and worsened by climate change. And in Minnesota, 91% of our Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, or BIPOC communities, live in areas with these high concentrated areas of high air pollution. Um, Many of these same communities, not coincidentally, are facing wealth inequality and are disproportionately impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. So these things are all related. And what we're trying to do in our work is more intentionally look at where resources are going, who's receiving energy efficiency programs to invest in the quality of their homes, who has access to clean transportation in their communities, whether it's their own electric vehicles or electric buses if they're using public transportation, who's able to get training and get a family supporting job in the clean energy economy. To answer your question, we're really working to better communicate about and track these factors so that we can ensure that BIPOC communities are not left behind.
Yeah. And Chris, I want to go to you next. Just kind of speaking of being left behind. Um, this year, with the killing of George Floyd and the subsequent protests and things that have persisted, we've seen a lot of corporate brands step out and make claims. None as bold as dismantle white supremacy. How did the Ben and Jerry's team arrive there?
Well, first, Conroy, thank you for facilitating this discussion. It's wonderful to join Orson and Ben as well. So thank you for that. You know, we are a unique company. We sell ice cream, but we really see ourselves as an organization or a vehicle to advance progressive social change. And that's really the model that our co-founders, Ben Cohen and Jerry Greenfield, set up 42 years ago. As been suggested, myself and Ben and Jerry's sit in a place of privilege and power. And I think when we're at our best, we really want to figure out how best to use that power to drive the kind of change that we need within society. We've been working on issues of racial justice at Ben and Jerry's, both inside our company, but also externally through our advocacy work for about 4 or 5 years. There have been a couple of moments during that time when, in addition to the ongoing work we're doing, we've been working in communities in Miami and St. Louis around issues of breaking the school to prison pipeline, closing a particularly horrible prison in the city of St. Louis. But there are moments when it is important to stand and be counted and to be bold. And in the wake of the tragic murder of George Floyd, we felt it was one of those moments. And while words are insufficient and not enough, words need to be said at certain times, and we felt like this was a moment. So I think, what perhaps made our statement stand out vis-a-vis other organizations and companies is that we were pretty stark about the issues, that we called out this issue of white supremacy. We specifically called on the president to stop normalizing hate speech, racism, and white nationalism on his social media channels. And we called for 4 specific actions that we could take as a society in order to begin to move forward, to acknowledge our past so that we may build a more just future. So for us, it just felt important to go on record in that moment.
Yeah. Thank you, Chris. Orson, I'm coming to you next. And you've done a lot of work in this space for a long time, both prior to your current role, but also in many respects in this role. And we see that, Black and brown communities across America are being impacted by the economy, by COVID. What's your perspective on, as you hear Chris talk about words matter and being bold, and I think the word he used was be counted and be bold, is what Chris said. When you hear that, given your history working in this field, what stands out to you about this moment?
Yeah, thanks, Conroy. First of all, just pleased to be part of this, and just what we're hearing is powerful, right? Like, how do you look at an issue like climate change and look at racial justice to make sure that we truly achieve climate change? And when corporations say they want to dismantle racism, how powerful that is, but just the examples that are given. And that's the type of stuff that I've been, dreaming about for the last, 2 decades. And in my current role, clearly, we see a lot of great energy, rightfully so. We see a lot of, as you mentioned with COVID-19, a lot of suffering, disproportionate impact and suffering in our Black and Latino, API, other working class communities, our indigenous communities. But I like the way you started the segment. You said from the street to the boardroom, and I call it, coming from a barrio in East LA, from the barrio to the boardroom. What does that look like, right? And when you get from the barrio to the boardroom, you get corporations, you get government really talking about our systemic inequalities and really thinking about comprehensive ways to fix them. And that's what we're seeing right now, very comprehensive ways, right? Corporations standing up against hate speech, standing up against incarceration, but then also doing things that they can do, right? Hiring more minority vendors, people of color vendors, women vendors, putting more people of color on the board, hiring more people of color and making sure those folks have great paying jobs. Corporate America, I would say, is kind of the last thing that we've unleashed to dismantle racism, right? We've seen a lot of efforts in government and we've left it up to government, but corporations, you don't need to, here for me are extremely powerful. The private sector is powerful. And when we unleash these forces, we're truly going to get to the place that we want to be. And that's a place where we have diversity, equity, inclusion in everything we see and do.
That's excellent. Chris, to his point around corporations being part of the solution more than ever, unleashing a new kind of capability in the effort to dismantle these biases that exist. What's your take on the shift that has happened where there is much more of an expectation for business to play a role versus business being able to compartmentalize and say, I sell ice cream, right? And that no longer works. What's your perspective there?
I think Conroy, we sit at the confluence of a few forces that have come together to create this moment. One is we have seen trust and a lack of faith in institutions that traditionally would be leading the kind of work and change that people are looking for. And so, as you noted, there is increasing expectations that corporations engage in these issues that our society is wrestling with. So on the one hand, I feel like in many ways, it's a commentary on where we are as a society that people are looking to ice cream companies like Ben & Jerry's to be a part of catalyzing some of the change that we need within society. On the other hand, for better or for worse, and it is too often for worse, corporations are the most powerful entities at this time in society. They have great influence over both people, the relationships that we have with our fans and customers, and they have influence over our political system and policymakers. And so with an increased expectation from people, consumers, citizens, that corporations play in a more active role, corporations are increasingly trying to navigate this space. And I think, there is a big opportunity here, right? And we as an ice cream company, even though people know we're a company that has a set of values and promotes, issues that would traditionally be seen as more progressive in nature, we speak to a broad general population, right? We sell more ice cream at Walmart than anywhere else. And so we are not preaching to the choir, and we have an opportunity to help drive a narrative, to help our fans and consumers become engaged and a part of these movements that we are a part of. And I think increasingly that is the expectation. And so I think we sit at a moment where collectively the corporate community has an important role to play in creating a set of norms and a sense of stability in a time of chaos that will allow us, I hope, to make progress on some of these issues.
Yeah. And so you spoke to us just now about kind of the corporate posture, the corporate voice in leading the way and helping to shape that narrative at the very top. But then there's some brick and mortar systemic things that really need to be dismantled. And when I think about it, nothing is more fundamental than energy, right? We talked about this earlier in the week, Ben, when we chatted about, people sometimes don't think about all the different ways that energy intersects in their life and where there are so many inequities in communities that they wouldn't think about. I'd love to help if you could just crystallize for folks the headwinds that you're up against and what it's going to take to move us forward in terms of racial equity as it relates to energy.
That's a great question, Conroy. I think, Chris talked about, the opportunities for corporations to lead and really around kind of messaging and really driving the narrative. I think the same can really be said for, choices around energy. I think in our work, we've seen corporations really taking up the mantle of fighting the climate crisis, whether it's investing in renewable energy or, even just, I guess less flashy things like investing in energy efficiency in their corporate headquarters, for example. I think what's really tricky is that while we are really excited to see that, we're really excited to see that leadership, and it's critically important if we're really going to address the climate crisis, we also want to make sure that those communities that don't have the resources to invest in the next wave of clean energy are still able to access them. And so I think what we're up against is really trying to make sure that under-resourced households or low-income households or renters are really able to access those same things, just as wealthier households or corporations and companies are able to. I think what's really important to realize is that this isn't just things like systems and structures that we're working within, but even just barriers within your day-to-day life. Rental households, for example, aren't able to make those decisions about energy investments because they don't own their home, and that is a systemic issue. That's a racial issue. Just as an example from Minnesota, 77% of white households own their home compared to just 41% of people of color. So these are overlapping intersectional issues, and I think what's important to realize, to your point, Conroy, is that energy is everywhere. It touches our housing system. It touches transportation. It really, touches everything that we do. So I think what we are really trying to be more intentional about to address these issues is really partner more directly with community-based organizations who are, really actively working in communities and with communities. We're working on developing educational resources that are informed by the community so that we're ensuring that it's actually accessible to people that we want to benefit from the programs and policies that we're working on. That work then feeds back into the policy work that we're doing so that we're figuring out, okay, who needs to be at the table when we're shaping and influencing these policies, who needs to benefit from the outcomes, and really just intentionally thinking about process and outcome and making sure that that's, really centered in everything that we're doing. I think the last thing that I just want to acknowledge is that being here in the Twin Cities and in Minnesota, I have to be candid. I think I feel a tremendous amount of accountability to make sure that our communities are benefiting. The murder of George Floyd rocked our community to its core. And if you drive through Minneapolis, still to this day, communities are rebuilding. And, I think there's layers to that too. I think, we've seen small businesses and BIPOC owned businesses really struggling to recover, not just from the economic downturn and the COVID-19 pandemic, but from the civil unrest in our communities after George Floyd was murdered. And, in addition to that, I think as communities rebuild, we want to make sure that they're doing it in a way that is really helping the community. So, are we looking at ways to really help, provide some of those clean energy investments that will really help them in the long term? Are we looking at ways to really make sure that community hubs are resilient and that homes and businesses in the area are really, thriving for decades and generations to come? So, I think there's so many different layers to this, but it's really personal, I think, to an extent in the community here in the Twin Cities and in Minnesota. And I just appreciate, the acknowledgement from Chris and Orson, about all of the different ways that we have to think about this in the wake of the murder of George Floyd.
Yeah, it's clearly multidimensional, and there's no magic bullet to solve all the ailments that we have as a society, but we sure need to come together. And one of the things, just going to you next, Orson, you work for an organization that's about creating nonpartisan voices for the Latinx community, and I know you recognize the collective power of unity. Maybe speak to a little bit about how your organization is supporting efforts like Black Lives Matter, and what is the importance of allyship at this moment, and how should people think about allyship?
Yeah, for us, it's been ingrained, and we've been doing it for years, right? When we talk about coalitions in Washington, D.C., we're there and have been for many years, if not decades, with folks from the NAACP, from the Urban League. And so, one of the reasons why I came to this organization was because it has that history of working cross-sector along Black, Latino, Asian Pacific Islander, Indigenous alliances. And so this is not new for us, but definitely, looking forward, it does, we do have to acknowledge and really think about how can we be more inclusive of our Afro-Latino community. We heard in the previous segment, there was a Panamanian mentioned, right? There's a lot of Afro-Latinos that, need to be included. We need to be inclusive of that. We need to talk about that. We need to also acknowledge that there is discrimination, racism in our own community. We got to be bold enough and brave enough to call it out, to talk about it, because if we don't, it'll continue to happen. So those are some of the things we're doing. But I think the thing that also is very exciting is, and you mentioned it, is the word accountability. right? When we work with a cross sector of folks, with other communities, I think that accountability is going to be critical. When corporations make statements related to their financial goals, they're held accountable, right? They're held accountable by their shareholders, by their board members. And so, together working in alliance with some of these communities, I think the accountability thread is going to be as equally as important, because boards, shareholders also need to hold corporations accountable for the statements that they're making today. We need to applaud them for their statements, but also need to hold them accountable. The accountability is going to happen best when we work across with other organizations, as we mentioned before.
Yeah, and I'd love to, top of everyone's mind is we're a few days away from an election. An important topic, business is paying attention, our communities are paying attention. As you guys are thinking about both your commitments that you've made to your different stakeholders and what they expect of you, how are you thinking about communicating, in terms of what you see as you look towards the future? Chris, let's start with you. As you guys are having conversation, you're coming up on the election, you're seeing this intersection of the growth of increasing expectations of business, a bit of a division happening, right, in the country in many ways, and a bit of a kind of a cocktail coming together. So as you discuss this, how do you process and think about then how do you communicate?
It's a really good question, Conroy. I think these are, in many, at least within my lifetime, my adult lifetime, these are sort of unprecedented moments. I think I'm optimistic. I believe that we are on the cusp of what will be an election where we will have incredibly high engagement and voter turnout, despite being in the midst of a global pandemic. I mean, already we're seeing people waiting hours in line to vote. I think we are going to have the highest rate of young voter turnout, perhaps in a generation or more. So I'm optimistic about the future, and I also believe. Look, I don't want to minimize the serious issues that our society must wrestle with. But I actually don't believe we're as polarized as some would like us to believe. I believe that there is a broad consensus in our country around things like people ought to have access to health care. People ought to have the ability to go vote, that climate change is a thing that we need to deal with. I think we've been led to believe by those who want polarization to serve their narrow political agenda that there's this huge gulf, and I don't think that exists. And I think I'm hopeful that we will find a way to move forward together, that will create a sense of stability within our country that will allow us to address some of these critical issues, and also, frankly, create a stable environment for companies like ours to continue to buy milk from family farmers, turn it into ice cream, and sell it to folks at Walmart.
I love that. We've got about a minute remaining, but I want to give each of you a last word. Ben, for you, for those out there watching today, what's your message to them as they go back home and they've listened to this conversation? What do you want them to take away from you today?
Thanks, Conroy. I talked about it a couple of times, but I think for me, it just comes back to intentionality. Intentionality is so critical, and it can be good or bad. I think I gave an example of, I guess what I would call malicious intentionality in the example of the Rondo neighborhood in St. Paul, and really, the destruction of Black communities. But even just, the lack of intentionality can be bad if we're not actively thinking about really addressing disparities, really ensuring that, all folks are part of the solution and, really receive all the benefits. We're not going to get where we need to be. And this is the time to really lean in. It's a time of compounding crises, of a global pandemic, of systemic racism, of climate change. And whether systemic racism or climate change, the only way we're really going to, confront the challenge in the time that we need to confront it is to actively, face it head on. We can't just be passive. So I'm really excited to roll up our sleeves and do the work together, and really appreciate the time today, and was great to be here with you all.
Arsen, you get the last word. Get it in there.
Vote. You know, it's that
Vote.
simple. You know, the single biggest thing you can do in the next few weeks is vote, especially for young people. As you know, as Chris mentioned, this, you know, everything we talked today about are important for now, but more important for the future. If young people vote, if their voices are heard, change will happen.
Ben, Chris, Orson, you guys have been incredible. Thank you all for tuning in and watching us this afternoon. I hope you had a great time and hope you found some useful information. And stay tuned.